Well, hello, buddy. So good to see you. Thanks for coming to church, everybody online. Thanks for joining us as well. I got to start with some bad news. Are you ready? So Savannah, who just sang those last couple songs, she graduated from high school this year, and she is choosing to go to college in Oklahoma. It's just the worst idea ever, isn't it? But this is what I prayed. Jenny and I prayed for our kids. Montana would be a black hole and eventually pull her all the way back, right? Okay, hey, we're jumping into kind of a standalone week. We finished up a series in the book of 1 Corinthians. I'd like to talk a little bit today from Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9. I mean, if you don't have a Bible with you, we'll have it on the screens. And I want to talk about this thing which some of us might be very familiar with this, and then others of us, it's like, I know the word, but I'm not sure what that means. So I want to talk about what it means to be a disciple, okay? A disciple. So a couple of words that aren't a part of English vocabulary that will help us understand what's happening in Luke chapter 9. One is the word rabbi, okay? Rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And Jesus is considered a rabbi. He's this like terribly unorthodox rabbi. And it hasn't like gone through the traditional route to becoming a rabbi. And then the word disciple is in Greek, mathetes, and it means follower. So in order for us to understand this passage of scripture, we're gonna have to kind of rethink our whole concept of education. So what we value here in the United States of America is education for all, right? And at 5, 6 years old, we start in kindergarten, and then everybody gets to graduate into first grade, and then you keep moving forward. And then when you get to high school, we're trying to get everybody to graduate through 12 years of formal education. And what you do is you go to a location, we call them schools, and the teachers join you at the schools, and we spend 5, 6, 7 hours a day educating people. That's how we do education. And then there's options. If you choose, you can go on and go to college, you can go on to graduate school, you can go on and get a PhD, right? And so that would be, boy, by the time you got your PhD, you've been in school a really long time. Well, it was completely different in the first century. One is education, formal education, even in Jewish culture, was almost exclusively for men, okay? And all young boys would go to the synagogue, which was like a church, okay? In every village, there would be a synagogue. If you had a minimum of 12 Hebrew men, you had to build a synagogue. And the education would happen there, and it's divided into 3 parts, okay? 3 parts. So everybody got to be a part of the first. So these are divided into houses of. So the word Hebrew, the word bet means house in Hebrew. So the first one was Bet Sefer, which meant house of the book, okay, house of the book. And what they focused on are the first 5 books in the Older Testament. This is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And from the ages of 6 to 10, you would study and restudy and memorize those first 5 books of the Bible. And what they believed is that gave everybody in a Jewish community, it gave you the narrative of creation. It gave you the story of people who are making mistakes but coming back to God, of the Exodus when the Hebrew people have been slaves in Egypt, and then all of the law. So the reason this was so important is because your morality, your ethics, your social values all emanated, if you were a Hebrew person, from these first 5 books of the Old Testament. But then at 10 years old, there was this cutoff point. And only a small percentage of Hebrew men were allowed, boys, were allowed to go on to the next set of learning. If you weren't an exceptional student, you then followed your father, most likely, into a trade. If your father was a merchant or a carpenter, at 10 years old, you'd enter into an apprenticeship to learn a trade. But that small minority that had really excelled at the house of learning would move on to the Bet Talmud, which is this next house. It's a place where you learn. They would then study the rest of the Old Testament. And that would go from about ages 10 to 14. At 14, there's another cutoff, and only the most exceptional students would go on to the next house, and that was the house of Midrash, which is the house of study. And you would study not only the scriptures, but you'd study Jewish law, interpretations of Jewish law, what other rabbis had taught. And then at the end of that, you're 17 years old, This tiny minority of people have gone through the whole education system, and there were really two options ahead of you, okay? Option one is you'd been a good student, but now you entered into a trade. Option two, and this is what Hebrew families would have just hoped for, is that one of the rabbis, one of the teachers who had been educating you or your children for all these years would do this. So the rabbis are just scanning. They're looking at these remaining students. And they would take on 1, 2, maybe just a handful of students every year. At the completion of that third stage of education, here's what a rabbi did. It showed up unannounced to your house. Would knock on the door, you'd open the door, and it's Rabbi Gamaliel. And you open the door and you're like, Rabbi Gamaliel, this is the one that's been teaching my son. You'd call your son would come to the door, and this is what the rabbi would do. Just a handful of people every year. Just say this, follow me, follow me. And that meant that you had been invited to be a disciple of the rabbi. And at that moment, you could not pack a bag. You couldn't say goodbye, kiss your mom goodbye. The rabbi left your doorstep, and your job was to leave everything behind and to follow the rabbi. And then for typically decades, you would be a disciple of the rabbi. And there's this old tradition that says this is how you know if you're a good disciple. That you follow your rabbi so closely that the dust from his feet ends up on your clothing. Meaning wherever your rabbi is going, you are going, and you observe and you learn, and all of the truth from the rabbi is eventually given toward this disciple. And then maybe when you're 40 or 50 years old, you would become a rabbi, and you would start scanning to see who the exceptional people were. Like, this is the person, and you'd knock on their door. So this has been going on for centuries. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus is working with his disciples. Now, here's something that's a little bit different about Jesus' disciples. All of them that we know about were already involved in the trades when he asked them to follow him. So, probably most of them had never made it beyond the first house. They were 10 years old, and they weren't exceptional students, and so they had entered into the trades. We know that one of them is a tax collector. We know that several of them are fishermen. So they're kind of average people. They're not like the valedictorians, right? Some of you were probably valedictorians. I love this. My oldest son married a valedictorian. And he gets to say this, between the two of us, we never got a B in high school. Yeah, it took a little bit, right? Because she never got a B, and I don't know if he ever got a B, but he got through high school, right? They were sitting in very different places at graduation. So not all of us have this exceptional capacity, to end up being chosen by the rabbi, but here's what Jesus did. When Jesus went to look for his disciples, he didn't go to the synagogue. He didn't go to the schools of learning. He went and found people who were fairly average. And he did the same thing that the rabbis did. He comes up to a group of men who were fishing. They're in a family business. They had a frustrating day of fishing, and Jesus says, hey, let's go back out. And he says, let's cast your net on the other side. And they're like, okay, Rabbi, we've heard that you're a good teacher. And they have this enormous catch of fish. It's like a career-making catch of fish. And then Jesus looks at them and says, follow me. The same words that a rabbi would speak. And they literally leave their boats and their business and the family tradition, and they follow Jesus. So Jesus had accumulated 12 disciples, 12 young men, probably from 16 to 19 years old. He said, follow me. And from Luke chapter 1 to Luke chapter 8, they've just been following Jesus. They've been good disciples. I want to be so close that the dust of Jesus is on me. They've been observing, and here's what they've observed. They've observed Jesus doing things that no other rabbi had ever done. They observed people being miraculously healed. They observed Jesus talking about the Father in ways that no other rabbi talked, as if he actually knew who God was. Rather than a theologian who's talking about a God, Jesus talked about his Father. They had seen Jesus come face to face on numerous times with the demonic oppressive evil that lives in this world, and they've seen him have authority to set people free, to come against everything that's broken in this world. So they've been observing, they've been watching, and the whole book changes in Luke chapter 9 because this is what the rabbi does. They're following, he stops in Luke chapter 9, he looks at his followers, and he says, now I'm sending you. To be a part of what I'm doing on planet Earth doesn't mean that you're an observer. It's not just about belief. Rather than waiting till they're 50 years old to become rabbis, he says, now it's your turn. That's what we're going to read here in a moment. I also want to say something else. I think probably in our context, and just the North American Christian church in general, we talk more about belief and less about discipleship, and I think we should reverse that. Belief is important, right? Jesus asked people to believe in him. And belief, I think, is a first step. You struggle. Some of us in the room, some of us watching, we're even right now, we're spiritually unresolved and these teachings of Jesus and this new way of viewing the world. You're having to come to this place, you're learning, and cognitively you have to make steps of faith, and you are beginning to believe. And belief is important. But do you know that Jesus never asked anyone to simply just believe in him? He asked them to follow him. He asked them to become disciples, mathetes. And so for some of us, as we read this, if you are, maybe you're on the verge of belief, or maybe you're a believer, like as we read this, just know this, Jesus wants more than just your belief. You can believe, and I think your eternity is secure and all that's wonderful. But Jesus, when he was leaving planet Earth, he did not look at his followers and say, go into all the world and make believers. He said, I want you to go in all the world and make disciples, followers, people who would leave anything to pursue the rabbi. Okay, with that in mind, let's read together from Luke chapter 9. We'll read the first 10 verses. Luke 9. When Jesus had called the 12, these are these 12 disciples, called the 12 together, so they come to him, he gave them, right? So there's this generosity. He gave them 1, power, 2, an authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases, power, authority, presence. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God. This is one of these themes of Jesus where the kingdom of this world, it's like might makes right. It's do more, try harder, try to appease the wrath of God. The kingdom of God is this. It is not might makes right, and it is not me doing more and trying harder to be a better human being. This is about grace and salvation and God's love and second chances and to heal the sick. So they're going to talk and they're going to do. Talk and do. He told them, take nothing for the journey. No staff. No bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave their town as a testimony against them. So they set out. They set out and went from village to village, preaching the good news. God has come to earth. There is a solution to human misery and pain and emptiness. The good news, the gospel, and healing people everywhere. Now, Herod is this puppet king that works for the Roman government. He collects taxes. They allow him some power. Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was going on, and he was perplexed because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead. Though John the Baptist had approached Herod because of some of his moral issues, and Herod had him beheaded. And so Herod's like nervous. Maybe John's back from the dead. Like 12 Johns are back from the dead. So he's a little nervous. Others said that Elijah, a famous Old Testament prophet, had appeared. And still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. But Herod said, I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? And he tried to see him. So Jesus is making a stir, and now what is really perplexing to Herod is it's not just Jesus anymore. It's these 12 disciples of Rabbi Jesus who are doing the same things. This is going to be impactful to the nation. When the apostles returned, they came back to Jesus, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. Let's talk a little bit about discipleship. I'm gonna use a sports metaphor, okay? If you're not a sports person, that's okay. I'll walk you through it. Has to do a little bit with football, all right? I've got 3 boys that all play football, so it's kind of on the brain. Number 1, let's talk about this. If you want to understand discipleship, I think you have to understand this term, the huddle, okay? The huddle. Now, those of you who are not football fans, the huddle is that thing where you see like very large men gathered in a small circle holding hands, right? Before every play, people gather together, you get in this huddle, you get really close, and in the huddle, somebody, usually the quarterback, or if you're on defense, whoever's running that, looks at all the other players, everybody doing okay, everybody know their assignment, and like, here's what we're going to do, now go. And you clap and walk into your position. So Jesus brings this huddle mentality to discipleship. It all begins with this. He called the 12 to himself. To himself. This is where discipleship begins. Discipleship is not an accumulation of knowledge and truth. Knowledge and truth is important. Discipleship is not just reading more and more of the Bible. The goal of being a disciple is not that you win Bible trivia. The goal of discipleship is that you are in the proximity of the Rabbi Jesus. That you are close to him, that you hear him, that you have been following him. And in the huddle, these things are distributed. I love this. In the huddle, Jesus says this. He says, I want you to know that everything flows out of my presence. It flows out of my relationship with you. So please hear this. If somehow in your mind, and this is very natural, that becoming a Christian is simply this, is that you're adopting a new worldview, it is much more than that. It is you're following a new rabbi. And you try to follow him so closely that the dust from his shoes ends up on you at the end of every day. It's the presence of God. Here's the second thing. In the huddle, Jesus looks at them and he gives them power. Power. It's the ability to accomplish the task. He says, here's what we're gonna do. What you have been watching me do, what I came to planet Earth to do, to begin to make everything that's crooked and broken and unjust and ugly, we're gonna bring beauty and healing and wholeness. He says, and I am actually giving you the power, the ability, the capacity to see this happen. And then he gives them one more thing. He gives them authority. Authority. It's the right to do it. Because what are they being asked to do? It's really fun to watch Jesus do all these things. But he stops and he turns, he says, and now, this is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. It means that you encounter the darkest, most broken elements of human life. And you move towards it. And you bring healing and freedom and deliverance. It means that you have a message. You get to speak about the Father, not as a theologian, but as a son or a daughter. It means that you confront human misery and sickness, and rather than say, I am so sorry that happened to you, you move towards it and say, how can I help bring about health and healing to this moment? And you're given authority. I had an experience years ago. It was early 90s, and my father graciously invited me on a trip to East Africa. We're in the nation of Uganda. The first time I'd ever traveled internationally, and I was jet lagged and unable to sleep. It was the first night we were there. We were in this little country town and just taking forever to get there. It's probably 2 or 3 in the morning. I can't sleep, so I get up and I'm walking around. And as I'm walking through the dirt streets of this little village, I hear yelling and cheering. I go, like, what is happening? And it's a group of Ugandans who are watching the World Cup. Now, for those of you who, like Americans, it's like, World Cup. For the rest of the world, it's like, right? And so they're in this little outdoor kind of pub thing, and there's a little black and white TV, and they are like enthusiastically, the place is packed watching the World Cup, and I'm kind of getting into it. I look across the room, and there's one other Anglo guy there. And he kind of nods at me, so I go over, and I can't speak Swahili, so I'm hanging out with him, and we talk for a couple of hours. I'm gonna tell you this about him. He was one of the nicest, most caring, most engaged human beings I've ever met. He was there working for the Peace Corps. He'd been there for 4 years. And he came to Africa because he said something has to change. He was there during the AIDS epidemic. He was there trying to work with literacy programs. He was working with clean water. He was trying to help everything that you could imagine, trying to face corruption. And after 4 years, this man with the best intent in the world, he was one of the most broken, hollow shells of a human being I ever met. He was utterly exhausted. He was planning how to get back to the States. He was overwhelmed by the pain in the nation that he found himself. He'd given it all. He kept breaking into tears as he would talk to me. And here's what I came to identify. This is a great guy. He was doing the work of Jesus without knowing Jesus. And if you try to go change the world without being in the huddle, without having a relationship with Rabbi Jesus, what do you miss? You miss his presence, you miss his power, and you miss his authority. And all you can do is the best that you can do. And when you've given everything you've given, there's nothing left. And my heart just broke for this guy. I so admired his dedication, but there was this missing element. And here's what Jesus says. Discipleship is this. I'm gonna ask you to change the world, but you've gotta come to me. Nothing happens unless you are in my presence, because when you face the pain, the difficulty, the ugliness in the world, if you don't have power and authority in the presence of Jesus, you're gonna face that with your own resources, and your own resources will never, ever be enough. So as a disciple of Jesus, you're asked to change the world, but you are not asked to change the world by yourself. The rabbi says, looks you in the eye. He says, power to overcome the ugliest, darkest things on this planet, I give to you. Power to speak a message that can liberate human lives, I give you. I give you authority over the things that tear people's lives to pieces. I give it to you. Here's the second thing about discipleship. One is you come to the huddle, you come with Jesus. He's the one who always sends. But then there's a game plan, right? So in this huddle, Jesus gives them a game plan. He says, here's what I want you to do. And in the huddle, he says, I want you to tackle drive out demons. I want you to cure diseases. I want you to preach the kingdom. I want you to heal the sick. Kind of a tall order, isn't it? Like, hey, go find everything that's broken in the world and why don't you address it? So this is the target. The target of discipleship is not, you notice what's not on this list? Pain-free life, prosperity, constant joy and peace. Jesus says, you want to be my disciple and you want to go, you want to move beyond just belief? Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to engage yourself in everything that's wrong in this world. That's the game plan. Go towards what's broken in the world. And then he says this in the huddle. He says, not only do I want you to have a target, he says, I want you to travel with extreme simplicity. Extreme simplicity. You remember as we read, Jesus looks at him, he says, hey, as you go, make sure you don't take any money, no change of clothes, no satchel, like so you can't bring food along with you. And the interesting thing, he says, no staff. So part of why Jewish people in the first century would walk with a staff is you were just communicating to everybody that I'm going a long ways, and you should be hospitable to me, right? So when you came into town, like, oh, that guy's walked a long ways, and there's this Jewish hospitality. So he says, when you show up in a village, I don't even want you to look like you're in need. How many of you guys are, like, when you go on a trip, you take a suitcase, like a big suitcase, right? I am personally a super light packer, yes. Husband just raised wife's hand. Does she have the suitcase that's kind of like a coffin? You're like, just in case you die, I can bring you back in this as well? Yeah, I'll just wear all your clothes, put your body in here, we'll get you back to the state. Yes. I'm super light packer. I've gone like 2 weeks in a little bag like this, and I'm like, what's the deal? You just wash your clothes in the sink. All you need is two shirts, 2 pants, you're fine, right? My brother, I met 2 of my brothers. We were at some meetings down in Wyoming this week, and we had some free time and went on a horseback ride. And my brother Jake flew with this. Have you flown with any of these new tickets? They're like super cheap, but you can't take any luggage with you. It's like if it doesn't fit in a shoebox and go into your seat. So he came to this week-long series of meetings, and all he had was flip-flops. So we're going horseback riding, like with this legit Wrangler into a wilderness area. And he's got like jeans on and a cowboy shirt and a cowboy hat and flip-flops. And the Wrangler looks at him like, are you seriously doing this? And he's like, it's all I got. And I have this picture. It's just like my favorite picture, like my brother riding a horse in a cowboy hat with flip-flops. And there's a reason you wear boots. So you can travel light. Why would Jesus say, I don't want you to take anything with you? Here's another thing about discipleship. When you're a disciple, you trust the rabbi. It's not about resources. You know what? The kingdom of God, healing, restoration, all these things, it is never accomplished through financial means. More money, more resource doesn't change the world. You know what changes the world? Is people that say, I'm following Jesus on his mission, and I'm going to trust him for everything. I'm going to trust him that when I come to a situation that is beyond me, that I don't understand, that Jesus will tell me what to do. I'm going to trust him that when I come to a situation where it seems like this problem, I need millions of dollars to solve this, that the Rabbi Jesus will say there are solutions that have nothing to do with resources. You travel light so that you learn to depend upon Jesus, the Rabbi. And guys, this is a hard one for us because we live in this unbelievably prosperous society. And man, if I don't have a couple of credit cards and some dollar bills in my pocket, I feel vulnerable. And Jesus is saying this, follow me and trust me. The solution is not more and better marketing. The solution is not more money and more resources. The solution are people who trust the rabbi and follow him wherever he goes. Then Jesus adds this other element. This is important to understand with discipleship. He says, I want you to shake it off when you face rejection. So we use this term, like, have you ever seen a kid fall? It's really not that bad, but they get up and they're not sure, like, should I cry right now? And what do you say to your kid? Like, hey, shake it off. You're okay, shake it off. Well, here's how the Jewish people use this. In Jewish culture, they're surrounded by other nations. They called the other nations the Gentiles, they're non-Jews. So occasionally you had to make a journey and you had to leave the border of Israel and you had to go through another person's land. And so this is what you did. When you came to the border, you get ready like, okay, on this side of the border is Israel. You were metaphorically, but also symbolically and literally, you were supposed to shake all the dust off of your body so that you could get the filth, the uncleanness of the non-Jewish people off of you. And after you had shaken everything off, then you stepped over the boundary back into Israel so that you didn't bring any of that with you. This is what Jesus tells them to do. He says, when you go, there's two things that are going to be inevitable. Rejection is going to be inevitable. Failure is going to be inevitable. When you sign up to be a disciple of Jesus, it does not mean that everything will be rainbows and unicorns and butterflies. He says, you're gonna go out and I'm asking you to do a tough assignment. There's gonna be times where it doesn't go well. And when it doesn't go well, here's what I need you to do. I need you to get back on your feet. I need to shake it off. And I need you to just keep going. There are too many followers of Jesus who have been crushed by failure, who have been crushed by pain, difficulty in life. And we can just lay there. And I understand there's a grieving process. And I understand that pain is real. But when you are a disciple of Jesus, there is always a second chance. There is always forgiveness. There is always a new start. And so as a disciple, you stand up and you work through it and you shake it off. And you're like, Jesus, I'm not done. Where would you send me now? That didn't work out. But there is always a future when you are following Jesus. Then the very last thing would be this, that they actually do what Jesus asked them to do. They run the play. So they leave. I'm sure it was much easier when Jesus was doing all these things and they just got to watch and support. But they go and they enter that first village. And they're probably like, Like, we're supposed to be the ones who pray for sick people? We're supposed, like, Jesus is so good at talking. Why doesn't he just do this? But there's this engagement. Here's where miracles show up. Okay, this is a biblical truth. Miracles show up. We always want, like, God, do a miracle, and then I'll follow. Miracles happen this way. I step out, and God does the miracle in the midst of my stepping out. Jesus would say, like, ridiculous things to people. There's this guy who has a withered hand, probably some sort of cerebral palsy. And he hasn't been able to move his hand for his entire life. And what does Jesus say to him? Stretch out your hand. The point is, I can't stretch out my hand. But at the moment where he goes, all right, I'll try it. Jesus, this is like insensitive Jesus. He comes upon a guy who has been paralyzed. And he's laying on a litter. He's carried around all of his life. Since he's 40 years old, he's never been able to walk. And guess what Jesus says to him? Rise up and walk. That's not appropriate, is it? Like, I can't. But Jesus says this, here's where the miracle comes. Jesus is gonna say the words, but this guy has to decide something I've never been able to do before. I'm gonna give it a shot. And that's where the miracle happens. Step out. And when you step out, that's when the miracle comes. Now, I wanna close with just a couple of thoughts. I just want you to notice this. There's this pattern that whenever the word disciple is mentioned, almost always you will also find the word go. Go. Part of being a disciple is, remember, it's that follow me, and you just leave. You leave everything. Jen and I were talking the other day, like, just how much we love our life. I hope God lets me live a long life and die in Montana. But I also know this. Because we're disciples, I need to follow Jesus wherever he leads. And I pray to God it's not like New York City. Okay? But as a disciple, you have to be at that place. God, if that's where you're telling me to go, my job is not comfort. My goal is not to have everything that I want. My goal is to follow the rabbi. And where the rabbi tells me to go, we go. We go. I want to ask you this. Sometimes I find in my life that I'm more of a believer than a disciple. I believe, I've accepted, I have faith. But Jesus is calling us beyond being believers to being a disciple. If you are a believer, I applaud you. I'm so grateful for you. But that's not the end of it. Jesus didn't come just so that you could believe. He's also saying this. I want you to follow. And he's not just looking for those who have made it through all the systems of education. He's looking people who work at the construction site and the refinery and the schools and the houses, people who stay at home, people who are involved in marketing. Jesus knocks on the door of our life and he says, will you follow me? Beyond belief, would you bring into your community, would you bring into your office, your school, your job site, would you bring this miraculous, life-changing reality that you may be disguised as a nurse, but you're a disciple of the Rabbi Jesus? Which means that darkness is going to crumble in front of you, which means that there will be hope. You may be disguised as a realtor or a carpenter, but listen, you're a disciple of Jesus, which means the reality of darkness and brokenness has finally met its match because you're following the rabbi. I want to just ask one more thing. I have this profound sense that some of you who are watching online, some of us in the room, this is just a day. This is a moment. This is an hour in your life where it's time to move from just, I like the idea of Jesus, so I want to follow Jesus.